The machine had a sound Warren Holt knew the way he knew his own heartbeat. Not the engine alone, though he knew that too. Every RPM and every rhythm of it, the particular way the exhaust note changed when you hit a wet patch in the lower field, the way the hydraulics hummed when the loader was working at full extension. What Warren knew was deeper than the engine. It was the sound of the whole machine moving across his ground, the weight of it pressing into the soil his grandfather had first broken in 1931, the slight sway when the tractor crested the rise just north of the creek, the way the cab flexed almost imperceptibly when the rear wheels found the ruts that 3 generations of Holts had cut into this particular corner of eastern Nebraska. Warren was 49 years old in the spring of 2018, and he had been sitting in cab seats since he was 7. First in his grandfather's lap, then beside his father, and then alone working ground that his family had broken, nursed, argued over, and loved in the particular way that farmers love land. Not sentimentally, not the way people in cities imagine farmers love it, but with a fierce and daily attention that looks like obsession from the outside and feels like responsibility from within. There was no romance in it. There was only the work and the soil and the weather that neither asked your opinion nor accepted your complaint, and the yearly reckoning that told you whether your attention had been sufficient. The farm was 3,100 acres of eastern Nebraska hardpan and river bottom, growing corn, soybeans, and winter wheat in a rotation that Warren's father had developed and Warren had refined over 2 decades of incremental adjustment. The land wasn't dramatic. It didn't have the big sky scenery of the western plains or the lush green of the Corn Belt's wet heart further east. It was working ground, practical ground, the kind of land that asked the same question every spring, the same question it had been asking since the first Holt put a plow to it, and that question was simple and unchanging. Are you paying attention? The land rewarded the answer yes, with yields that ran consistently above county average. It punished the answer no in ways that showed up in the fall numbers and lingered in the balance sheet through the following winter. Warren's grandfather, Elias Holt, had claimed this ground under circumstances that Warren knew only in outline. Elias had come from western Iowa in 1929 with a wife, 2 children, a small amount of cash, and a stubbornness that people who knew him described as either admirable or infuriating, depending on the situation. He had purchased a 1.25 sections of ground at a price that the Depression was making available, had broken the virgin prairie with equipment that would look like museum artifacts. Now had survived the drought years of the 1930s through a combination of fortunate timing, careful water management, and the kind of grinding persistence that doesn't make for interesting stories, but does make for surviving farms. Elias had passed the ground to his son in 1961. Warren's father, Harold, had taken what Elias left and made it larger, better organized, and more profitable. Harold had passed it to Warren in 2007 when Harold died, and Warren had kept the trajectory moving in the same direction because it was the only direction he had ever understood. Harold Holt had died in October of 2007, a heart attack between the equipment shop and the house discovered by Warren's wife Barbara when dinner had gone cold and Harold still hadn't come in from the yard. He had been 71 years old. He had farmed until the week he died, which was how he wanted it, and he had left Warren the land clear of debt, which was the greatest gift any farmer could give his son. Not money, not equipment, not advice. Clear land. Ground that belonged to you outright, that no banker could threaten and no note could compromise. That was the inheritance that mattered. Harold's last real conversation with Warren had been 3 days before he died. They had been sitting at the kitchen table going over maintenance schedules for the equipment, the kind of methodical seasonal review that Harold had conducted every fall for 40 years, and Harold had said out of nowhere, the thing he said every fall, the saying that Warren had heard so many times as a child that it had become ambient part of the background noise of growing up on this land. Harold had looked up from the maintenance sheet and said, Don't let the land sleep more than 2 days. It was a saying about tillage and cover crops and keeping the soil biology active through the cold months. It was a reminder that the land was a living partner, not a passive asset, and that its health required constant engagement, even in the seasons when nothing was visibly growing. But it was also something else. It was a philosophy about attention, about the relationship between a person and the work they had chosen and the ground they had inherited. Don't let it go dormant on you. Keep your eyes on it. The moment you stop paying attention is the moment it starts paying you back for the neglect. Warren had not let the land sleep in the 11 years since his father died. He had paid attention every day in every season through 3 drought years and 2 flood years and 1 hailstorm in August of 2014 that had taken a third of his corn crop in 40 minutes. He had paid attention through the good years and the punishing years, through the years when the market cooperated, and the years when it seemed designed to specifically undermine every decision he had made. He had paid attention because Harold had told him to, and because every year that passed without a major failure was evidence that the advice was sound. By the spring of 2018, the operation was running as well as it ever had. The debt load was manageable. Warren carried approximately $380,000 in operating credit, a spring line he drew on for seed and chemical and fuel, and paid back in full each fall after harvest. His equipment was maintained in the way that working farm equipment should be maintained, not pristine, not restored to showroom condition, but mechanically sound and properly serviced, the kind of upkeep that prevents catastrophic failures rather than the kind that chases aesthetics. He ran 5 tractors across planting and harvest, plus a combine, 2 grain carts, and an assortment of tillage and planting implements that he had accumulated piece by piece over 20 years of buying good used equipment when it was priced correctly and holding it until it had given back the full value of the purchase. His relationship with Callaway Farm Equipment in Grafton had been built the same way piece by piece, beginning in 2006 when Warren had bought his first new John Deere from them. Callaway was a second-generation dealership founded by the Callaway family in the 1980s, operating out of a large facility on the north edge of Grafton, with a full service department, a substantial parts inventory, and a sales floor that carried new and used John Deere equipment across the full range of agricultural applications. The Callaway family had sold the operating management of the business to a professional management team a decade earlier, retaining ownership, but stepping back from day-to-day operations. The result was a dealership that ran efficiently by institutional standards and maintained the Callaway name's regional reputation, but which had in Warren's experience over 12 years. Gradually substituted process for the kind of personal judgment that the original family had brought to customer relationships. Dex Hartman had been the service manager at Callaway for 9 years. He was a trim-controlled man in his mid-50s with the practiced composure of someone who managed a high-volume service department and understood that his job involved as much customer expectation management as it did actual mechanical problem-solving. He knew the equipment lines well enough to have intelligent conversations about diagnostic findings. He ran his technicians, efficiently kept his service bays productive, and produced customer satisfaction numbers that met the targets. The dealership ownership tracked quarterly. He was competent in the institutional sense, skilled at operating within systems reliable in the delivery of outcomes that the systems were designed to produce. Warren had trusted Callaway the way he trusted his banker and his agronomist, not blindly, not with any illusion that their interests were perfectly aligned with his, but practically. They had the equipment. They had the parts inventory. They had trained technicians who understood the John Deere platform he was running. They were 40 minutes from the farm, which was close enough to be convenient, and far enough to be a different town with all the professional distance that implied. And for 12 years, they had kept his John Deere equipment running well enough that he had no reason to question the relationship. The friction that eventually altered that relationship did not announce itself as friction. It arrived as arithmetic. In the spring of 2016, Warren had been looking for a utility tractor, something in the 150 to 175 horsepower range that could handle grain cart duty and light field work without burning his heavier tractors on tasks that didn't require their capacity. Grain cart work in particular was hard on tractors because it combined long transport days with occasional heavy pulling, and Warren wanted a dedicated machine for the purpose, rather than pulling one of his primary field tractors out of rotation during harvest. He had called Callaway first. That was the natural first call. Dex had connected him with the sales department, and after several conversations and some back and forth on specifications, the number that came back was $184,000 for a used John Deere 721 OR with approximately 2,400 hours. Warren had done what he always did when a significant number arrived. He had checked it against the market. He had looked at auction results and dealer listings across a 200-mile radius, and the market told him that $184,000 was on the high end of the range for that machine in those conditions. It wasn't an outrageous number. It was a number designed to leave room for negotiation and to maximize margin within the zone of customer acceptability. Warren had mentioned this to the sales representative at Callaway. The number had moved to $179,000, which was still not where Warren thought it should be given what he was seeing in the broader market. A few weeks later, someone at the grain elevator mentioned that Gerald Sutter over at Prairie Iron Equipment had a used Massey Ferguson 7726 with low hours priced at a number worth looking at. Prairie Iron was a Massey Ferguson dealership 12 miles east of Grafton, a smaller operation than Callaway, but well regarded in the county for its service department and its parts availability. Warren had driven past it regularly without ever having a reason to stop. He stopped in the spring of 2016. The Massey Ferguson 7726 was priced at $136,000. The hours were lower than the comparable John Deere at Callaway. The machine checked out mechanically. The specifications matched what Warren needed for grain cart and utility work. Warren did the math carefully. He did it the way Harold had taught him to do it, without sentiment and without loyalty entering the calculation. The numbers said the Massey Ferguson was the better value. The numbers said the Massey Ferguson was the right decision. Warren bought it, Callaway noticed. Not formally. No one called to express disappointment, no one sent a letter, no one raised the subject directly. But the temperature in the relationship changed in the way that temperatures in rural business relationships change, gradually and unmistakably communicated through small signals that required no explicit statement. Service appointments that had previously been scheduled within 5 to 7 business days began running to 10 days, sometimes longer. The parts counter staff, who had greeted Warren by name for a decade, started looking at their computer screens when he walked in. Phone calls were returned slightly more slowly. Estimates were prepared slightly less urgently. Nothing you could point to as deliberate. Everything you could recognize as intentional. It was the social arithmetic of rural commerce. Loyalty was the currency, and Warren had spent some of his without consultation. The market was entitled to respond. Warren had not cared much about the temperature shift. The Massey Ferguson 7726 was performing well. Fuel consumption was better than expected. Gerald Sutter at Prairie Iron had proven himself to be the kind of dealer Warren valued most, a man who answered his phone, who gave accurate estimates, who completed work on the timeline he committed to, and who did not treat a customer's trust as something to be leveraged for maximum revenue. Warren had brought the Massey in for service twice in the first 2 years, an oil change and filter replacement the first time, a pre-season inspection and hydraulic fluid service the second, and both times the work had been completed correctly on time and within 5% of the estimate. By the fall of 2017, Warren had begun thinking seriously about the longer-term composition of his fleet. The math kept coming out the same way. Lower acquisition costs on comparable horsepower. Lower operating costs over the first several years of ownership. a dealer relationship built on demonstrated competence rather than institutional loyalty. The emotions pointed one direction, and the arithmetic pointed the same direction, which was the rarest and most reliable kind of decision. He had not announced this thinking to anyone. He had turned it over quietly, the way he turned over most significant decisions, giving it time to reveal whatever he might have missed. And then, 23 days before the 2018 planting season, the John Deere 733 OR began to die. The tractor was a 2011 model that Warren had purchased used in 2014 for $126,000. It ran 185 horsepower and handled primary tillage and a share of the planting work, one of the machines in regular heavy rotation from late March through mid-May and again during fall harvest. It had been maintained carefully. Warren had kept every service record from the day he bought it: oil changes, hydraulic fluid service, filter replacements, software updates, when the dealer had pushed them annual pre-season inspections. The machine had 4,800 hours on it in the spring of 2018 and had given no indication that anything was wrong. It was the machine his father had never driven but would have recognized. The scale was different. The technology was unrecognizable by Herald standards, but the fundamental purpose was the same: take the implement across the ground, do the work the season required, come back to the barn at night, and start again in the morning. Harold had trusted his machines because he understood them completely, because the machinery of his era was simple enough to be fully comprehended by a man who paid careful attention. Warren understood his machines differently through their behavior rather than their internal workings, through the patterns of what they did and didn't do, through the accumulated sensory knowledge of years of close daily contact. The first indication came at dawn on a Tuesday in late March. Warren was moving the 733OR from the shop to the equipment barn. Empty, no implement attached, a short drive across the yard that he had made 1,000 times. He was thinking about the soil temperature reading he had taken the previous afternoon, about whether the north field was going to be ready to work before the end of the week, about a conversation he needed to have with his seed supplier about delivery timing. He was not thinking about the tractor. Between third gear and fourth, the transmission hesitated. Not a grinding, not a slip, not a sound that announced itself as a problem. A pause, a fraction of a second, where the machine seemed to reconsider what it was doing before continuing. Warren noticed it. He filed it away in the part of his attention that tracked small anomalies without immediately escalating them, and he moved on. The hesitation returned the following morning in the same transition between third and fourth, and again that afternoon in a slightly different gear range. By the end of Wednesday, it had begun appearing in other gear changes as well, still intermittent, still subtle, but present with enough regularity that it was no longer something Warren could reasonably classify as a one-time anomaly. By the end of that first week, the transmission was doing something worse. Moving from fifth to sixth, the gear shift would sometimes delay a full second, not a fraction of a second. A full second, perceptible, uncomfortable, the machine refusing to proceed while the engine continued to rev against the hesitation. And occasionally, the shift would not happen at all. Warren would move the lever from fifth to sixth, and nothing would occur. The engine would climb in revolutions per minute. The tractor would not accelerate. The transmission would simply decline to engage the requested gear. He would pull the lever back to fifth, wait several seconds, try again, and sometimes the gear would catch, and sometimes it would require a third attempt. Warren called Callaway on the Friday afternoon of that first week. He described the symptoms to Donna, the scheduling coordinator he had spoken to dozens of times over 12 years. Donna said the earliest available service appointment was 11 days out. Pre-season maintenance rush. 2 machines in the shop with repair complications that were consuming more technician time than anticipated. She understood his concern about the timing, but the schedule was the schedule and she had no flexibility. 11 days. Planting season was 13 days away. Warren did the arithmetic in his head, while Donna was still expressing her understanding of his concern. 11 days to get the tractor into the shop. A diagnostic period of 1 to 3 days on top of that, based on his previous experience with Callaway's service workflow. Then whatever the actual repair required. He was looking at 2 weeks minimum before the machine would be operational, assuming the repair was straightforward. 2 weeks was past the planting window. He asked about a loaner tractor. Donna said all loaners were deployed. He asked about emergency or priority scheduling. She said she would put a note in the file and escalate if a cancellation opened up. He thanked her and hung up. He stood in the shop doorway and looked at the 7330R. He thought about the 300 acres waiting on the other side of the coming weeks. He thought about the corn planting window in this county, which was driven by soil temperature and historical weather patterns, and the unforgiving calendar of a growing season that started and ended on its own schedule regardless of mechanical problems. He thought about the load distribution across his 5 tractors during planting and whether it was feasible to absorb the 733OR's workload into the remaining machines. The answer was that it was theoretically possible and practically miserable. The 8260R and the 7726 could cover the 733OR's planting assignments if he ran extended shifts and accepted that both machines would be operating near their limits through the critical planting window. Operating near the limit was how you turned a manageable situation into 2 equipment problems instead of 1. He thought about hiring a custom operator to cover some of the planting acreage. Custom operators in this region were expensive during peak season, typically by a factor that made the option economically painful, and they were often committed weeks in advance. Finding one with capacity and availability in the next 2 weeks was possible, but unlikely. He thought about simply waiting the 11 days and hoping the diagnostic and repair could be completed quickly. Hope was not a planting strategy. He called Callaway back on Saturday morning and asked to speak with Dex Hartman directly. When Dex came on the line, Warren laid out the situation without embellishment. Planting began in under 2 weeks. The tractor was needed in the field. If Callaway could not make room for it in the next 48 hours, he would need to make other arrangements. He said this not as a threat, but as a statement of operational reality. Dex said he would look at what could be done. 40 minutes later, Donna called back and said, "Bring the tractor in that afternoon." Warren loaded the 733OR onto his flatbed and drove it to Grafton. Dex met him in the service bay, which Warren recognized as a small but not trivial accommodation. Dex had a shop apprentice with a tablet standing beside him, ready to record. He asked Warren to walk through the symptoms. Warren did so in detail, describing the progression from the initial hesitation to the intermittent refusals to shift the conditions under which the problem seemed more pronounced, the conditions under which it seemed to ease. He told Dex about the gear ranges where he'd first noticed it and where it had spread to. He told Dex how long it had been building. Dex nodded. He made notes in addition to whatever the apprentice was recording. He said they would run a full diagnostic scan and have findings for Warren within 24 hours. 24 hours passed. Warren called. Dex wasn't available. The service desk said the diagnostic was ongoing, and they would call when it was complete. Another day passed. Warren called again. This time, Dex answered. The diagnostic Dex said had identified a fault code in the transmission control system. The code indicated a failure mode in the transmission control unit, the electronic module that managed gear selection sequencing and hydraulic pressure routing throughout the transmission. Additionally, Dex said the diagnostic had shown indicators of wear in the clutch pack assemblies inside the transmission. The recommended repair path was to begin with replacement of the transmission control unit and, given the secondary indicators of internal wear, to replace the entire transmission assembly in order to prevent escalating failures. Warren asked for the number. The control unit alone was $9,100. The transmission assembly, remanufactured and sourced from the regional distribution hub, was estimated between $41,000 and $54,000, depending on which unit was available and what condition it arrived in. Labor for the removal and installation was $11,000 to $16,000, because the transmission on the 733OR was not a simple swap. It required partial disassembly of the tractor's frame and hydraulic systems and was estimated at 40 to 55 technician hours. Total estimate $52,000 to $71,000. Time to repair 7 to 9 weeks. The transmission unit had to be ordered from the distribution hub. 3 to 6 weeks for delivery depending on current stock. 10 to 14 days for installation once the component arrived. Warren stood in his kitchen holding the phone and did not speak for a moment. $71,000. He had paid $126,000 for the tractor 4 years ago. Its current market value, depending on condition and buyer, was somewhere between $88,000 and $102,000. The repair estimate was between half and two-thirds the machine's current value, and the timeline meant he would miss the entire planting season. He asked Dex if there was any possibility the transmission itself was sound, any scenario where the fault code was indicating something less severe than full transmission failure. Dex said the fault codes were consistent with transmission control unit failure and that the secondary hydraulic wear indicators in the system data were consistent with internal clutch pack degradation. He said the manufacturer protocol was to recommend comprehensive repair when the control unit fault appeared alongside hydraulic wear indicators. He said this was the conservative approach designed to prevent the customer from having the same problem return in the middle of the season after a less complete repair. He also mentioned that the dealership had a 2016 John Deere 727OR on the lot in good condition. They could work up trade-in numbers on the 733OR as it sat. Net financed cost on a trade would probably land around $195,000. Monthly payment at current rates would be in a range the dealership could help Warren analyze. Warren thanked Dex and said he needed to think. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he hung up. He looked at the numbers he'd written on the yellow legal pad he kept by the phone. The repair range, the trade-in estimate, the timeline in either direction. He arranged and rearranged the numbers the way he always arranged problems, starting from the facts and working toward what they required. None of the arrangements produced a result that felt right. A $71,000 repair on a $95,000 tractor was not inherently impossible. If the machine were going to run for another 8 or 10 years, you could argue the math. But the repair was based on a diagnostic that Warren had not yet had any independent reason to trust, produced by a dealer whose relationship with him had cooled since he'd bought the Massey Ferguson, recommending a fix that cost more than two-thirds the machine's current value on a timeline that cost him an entire planting season. The trade-in option was worse. $195,000 in new financing for a machine that replaced one that had been running fine a month ago would increase his total debt load to a level that his operating line would strain against. He had worked for years to keep his debt-to-asset ratio in a range his banker described as conservative. One equipment decision should not undo that. Barbara came in from the garden. She saw his face and sat down without speaking. She had been married to Warren for 24 years, and she knew the difference between his arithmetic face and his worry face. This was the second face. She sat across from him and waited. He showed her the numbers, the full picture, the repair estimate, the trade-in scenario, the seasonal calendar, the implications for the operating line in either direction. Barbara was the farm's bookkeeper. She had a quiet, meticulous understanding of the financial structure of the operation and a clear-eyed view of risk that Warren had always trusted more than his own, because she brought less emotional attachment to the machinery and more attention to the balance sheet implications. She looked at everything on the table for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "We can't do either one of those." She didn't mean they were literally impossible. She meant they were both bad decisions made under pressure, and that bad decisions made under pressure had a way of compounding over the following years in ways that good decisions made under pressure did not. She meant that before they accepted one of these two options, they needed to be certain that one of them was actually necessary. Warren said the certainty was the problem. He didn't know yet whether Calloway's diagnosis was right. Barbara said, "Then find out." He was still at the table an hour later when he heard Pete Ramsden's truck in the driveway. Pete Ramsden farmed 1,400 acres to the south and had been Warren's closest neighbor for 15 years. They were not the kind of close friends who socialized regularly or knew each other's inner lives. They were the kind of close neighbors who helped each other without being asked, who shared equipment during emergencies without accounting for it, and who exchanged information about the land and the weather and the market in the direct, unsentimental way of people who depended on the same variables. Word had reached Pete through the grain elevator network that Warren was having tractor trouble. He had come to offer equipment and labor if it was needed. Warren thanked him. He told Pete the situation, the diagnostic, the estimate, the timeline. Pete listened with the expression Warren recognized from years of county meetings and co-op conversations, the expression of a man processing information against a private catalog of related experience. Pete asked how much the estimate was. Warren told him the range, 52 to 71,000. Pete was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, "You know what happened to me in 2016? Warren said he didn't." Pete sat down. He said that in 2016 he had brought a smaller John Deere to Callaway with a hydraulic issue. The symptoms had been a slow hydraulic response and occasional pressure drops under load. Dex had quoted him $38,000 for a hydraulic pump replacement and associated system work. Pete had paid it because he had trusted the diagnosis and hadn't known to question it. 8 months later, he had been describing the repair in passing to a technician at an unrelated shop while getting some minor work done, and the technician had raised his eyebrows at the number and said that on that particular model, a $38,000 hydraulic job was on the very high end of what was possible because the pump itself was a $4,000 part with 8 hours of labor, and the associated system work should not have added more than another $6,000 to $8,000. Pete had never pursued it formally. He had no documentation of what had and hadn't been done. He had no way to prove anything had been wrong with the diagnosis or the billing. And in a community where Callaway employed 17 people and had been in business for 40 years, you didn't make accusations you couldn't prove. So he had kept it to himself. But he had not brought a machine to Callaway since 2016. Warren walked Pete to his truck in the dark. The night air was cold in the way of early April in Nebraska, when the days hint at warmth, and the nights remind you that winter hasn't fully conceded. The fields beyond the yard were black and still. 13 days until planting. A tractor with a problem that might cost $71,000 to fix, or might cost considerably less, depending on whether the diagnosis was accurate. A dealer relationship built on 12 years of business that had turned cool the moment Warren had exercised his right to make an independent purchasing decision. He went back inside. Barbara was at the kitchen table with her laptop open looking at numbers that were all bad in different arrangements. "Warren said I have a service appointment at Prairie Iron tomorrow morning. The Massey. Just the routine preseason inspection. I'm going to keep the appointment." Barbara looked up from the screen. She understood what he was not saying directly. She said it can't hurt to ask. Warren went to bed but did not sleep. He lay in the dark listening to the farmhouse settle and thinking about his father's voice saying, "Don't let the land sleep," and thinking about the fact that the land did not know or care about his equipment problems. It was going to warm up on its own schedule. The planting window was going to open on its own schedule. The season would proceed with or without him, and the gap between what got planted and what could have been planted would show up in the fall numbers with the same indifference to his circumstances that the weather showed every spring. 13 days. He needed the tractor or he needed a different answer. He was going to find out which one was actually available. Prairie Iron Equipment sat at the intersection of two county roads 12 miles east of Grafton in a low, wide metal building that Gerald Sutter had expanded twice since buying the dealership in 2004. The exterior was utilitarian in the way of working commercial buildings in agricultural country: metal walls, a gravel lot, a row of red Massey Ferguson tractors on the display line with their mirrors catching the early morning light. The interior was a different story. Inside Prairie Iron was organized in the way that genuinely well-run shops are organized, not performing organization for the sake of appearances, but actually organized tools in designated positions, parts on labeled shelves by make and model and application floors, swept clean, a diagnostic bay with updated equipment that Warren had noticed the first time he'd brought the Massey Ferguson in for service. There was a whiteboard in the service office covered in Gerald's handwriting, updated each morning, showing every machine in the shop with its status, its assigned technician, and its estimated completion date. Gerald Sutter was 61 years old, a compact and unhurried man with reading glasses that spent more time pushed up on his head than on his face, ink stains on his left hand from the markers he used on the whiteboard, and a way of listening that Warren had recognized and respected from their first conversation. Gerald had grown up on a farm in northwestern Iowa, gone into the equipment business at 22, worked his way through 3 dealerships over 2 decades, and bought Prairie Iron in 2004 when the previous owner retired. He had built it from a 4-technician operation to a full dealership with 6 technicians, a dedicated parts department, and a service backlog that in spring season sometimes ran 2 weeks, which was evidence of demand rather than dysfunction because Gerald's turnaround times on completed work were the best in the county. Warren pulled into the lot at 8:40 in the morning, backed the Massey Ferguson 7726 off the trailer with the ease of a man who had performed the operation hundreds of times, and went inside. Gerald came out of the service office when he saw Warren through the window. They shook hands. Gerald asked about the winter, about the soil temperatures, about whether the long-range forecast was making Warren optimistic or nervous about the spring planting window. These were not small-talk questions. They were the actual questions that structured every conversation in farming country at this time of year, asked in the shorthand of people who lived by the same calendar and worried about the same variables. Warren answered them. And because Gerald was looking at him with the patient directness of a man who had spent 4 decades reading people and machines, and understood that both of them communicated more through what they weren't saying than through what they were, Warren told him the rest. He went through it the same way he had gone through it with Pete Ramsden the night before. The transmission hesitation, the progression to intermittent refusals to shift, the call to Callaway, the 11-day wait, the diagnostic, the fault code, the estimate, $52,000 to $71,000. 7 to 9 weeks, the planting window, the trade-in suggestion that made less sense the more he looked at it. Gerald listened without interrupting. He didn't nod emphatically or offer sympathy that would have felt like performance. He listened with his full attention, which was a specific quality in him that Warren had noticed and valued the ability to take in a complete account before forming any response. When Warren finished, Gerald took his reading glasses down off his head and cleaned the lenses with the hem of his flannel shirt. He did this when he was thinking which Warren had seen enough times to recognize as a habit rather than an affectation. Gerald asked what model Warren said the 733OR. Gerald nodded once with a small expression that Warren couldn't quite read. He asked what was the fault code they pulled. Warren had the Callaway diagnostic sheet in his truck. He had brought it without entirely deciding why. He retrieved it. Gerald read it carefully, turning the sheet over as if looking for something on the reverse, then reading the front again with the same unhurried attention. He said, "Come here for a minute." "Come here for—" Gerald led Warren back through the shop. They walked past the service bays in use, past the parts room with its floor-to-ceiling shelving, past the small break room where someone had left a coffee cup and a folded newspaper on the counter. In the farthest bay, a man was working on the hydraulic system of a large, Massey Ferguson combine. Most of the man's upper body was inside the machine's access panel. Only his legs and the lower half of his work boots were visible. Gerald said the man's name, Ray. Ray Kowalski extracted himself from the combine's interior. He wiped his hands on the shop rag he pulled from his back pocket, the motion of a man who wiped his hands several dozen times a day and no longer thought about it. He was 43 years old, with the physical density of someone who had done skilled manual labor for 2 decades, not heavy in the undifferentiated sense, but compact and deliberate, with hands that were permanently stained by the work and eyes that moved to the mechanically relevant detail of any situation, the way an experienced reader's eyes move to the important word in a sentence, without bothering with the surrounding text. Gerald handed him the diagnostic sheet without preamble. Ray read it. He did not read it quickly. He read it with the same methodical attention he appeared to bring to everything, processing the information rather than scanning it, filing each piece against whatever internal architecture of mechanical knowledge he carried. When he finished, he said, "This is a trigger code. It's not a conclusion." Warren asked what that meant. Ray said the fault code on the sheet was what he described as an umbrella code, a broad flag that the transmission control system generated when it detected operational variance outside the expected parameter range. The code was the system's way of saying something is operating differently than the baseline. It was not the system's way of saying the transmission is mechanically failed. Those were 2 different statements, and the process of distinguishing between them was the reason the manufacturer's service manual included a specific second step in the diagnostic sequence, a manual test that bypassed the electronic control system and evaluated the transmission's mechanical components directly under simulated operating load, with a technician observing the behavior. The manual test took approximately 4 hours on the 7330R platform. It required specific knowledge of the platform and the use of the shop's hydraulic load simulation equipment. It was not an obscure procedure. It was in the service manual. It was labeled Step 2 of the standard diagnostic sequence. Ray said Callaway had not run Step 2. Warren said, "How do you know?" Ray pointed to the diagnostic sheet. He said the sheet showed the fault code retrieval, the code interpretation, and the repair recommendation. There was no notation of mechanical testing. If the manual test had been run and had shown transmission failure, the sheet would have documented the test conditions, and the findings. The absence of that documentation was not ambiguous. The manual test had not been performed. Callaway had retrieved the fault code, identified it in the manufacturer's diagnostic decision tree, found the recommended repair for that code in the decision tree, and given Warren the estimate that the decision tree produced. They had not done the work required to determine whether the decision tree's recommendation was actually correct for this particular machine in its actual condition. Warren stood in the bay and absorbed this. He looked at the diagnostic sheet in Ray's hand. He looked at the combine Ray had been working on, half disassembled with the particular systematic disassembly of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to get to it. He said, "Can you look at it?" "Can." Ray said yes. He said he knew the 733OR's transmission architecture. He had worked on the platform for 3 years at the John Deere dealership, where he had spent 14 years before coming to Prairie Iron. He knew it as well as he knew most machines, which was to say he knew it well enough to have a strong diagnostic opinion before he had looked at it and a reliable diagnosis after. Warren said, "What does it cost to find out?" Ray said 2 hours of diagnostic time at the shop rate, plus 4 hours for the manual test sequence. 6 hours total at Prairie Iron's service rate. He said he would have a diagnosis for Warren by end of day. Warren said he needed to get the tractor from Callaway first. He used his cell phone to call Dex Hartman from Prairie Iron's parking lot. The call was short. Warren told Dex he was having the tractor evaluated at another facility. Dex said the tractor was not in Callaway's possession in any formal legal sense, and that Warren could move it wherever he chose. He said Callaway would bill for the diagnostic hours completed so far. Warren asked how much. Dex said $420. Warren put it on a card over the phone. He thanked Dex. He hung up. He drove to Callaway, picked up the 7330R without going inside the building. A shop apprentice drove it out and loaded it while Warren stood by the trailer, and he drove it back to Prairie Iron and put it in the bay. Ray had cleared. Then he drove home to wait. The afternoon was long. Warren went through the motions of the day's other work, reviewing seed delivery schedules, checking soil temperature readings in the north and south fields, going over the planting equipment maintenance checklist that he would have been completing with the 7330R if the 7330R were available. He did these things with partial attention. The larger part of his attention was in Prairie Iron's service bay with Ray Kowalski and the tractor. His son Marcus arrived at the farm around 4 in the afternoon. Marcus was 22 years old, had grown up on the farm, but had gone to college in Lincoln and stayed there after graduation, working at a logistics company while he figured out what he wanted. He had been back for occasional weekends, but had not been a fixture of the farm's daily life for 3 years. Warren and Barbara had not pressured him. The farm would be there. Marcus would find his way to it, or he wouldn't, and Warren had spent enough years watching young people forced into their parents' choices, turn bitter about those choices, to know that the farm was better served by a willing operator than an obligated one. Marcus had heard from Barbara that there was a situation with the equipment. He had come to see if there was anything he could do. Warren was in the equipment barn when Marcus found him not doing anything productive, just standing near the old tractor that had been Harold's primary machine in his last years, a 1998 model, with a blown head gasket that had been sitting in the corner of the barn for 3 years, too expensive to fix relative to its current value, but too laden with association for Warren to have sold it yet. He had a habit of standing near it when he was thinking through difficult things. He was not sure when the habit had started. Marcus pulled up a stool and sat across from him in the barn's late afternoon light, with the smell of oil and steel and old wood around them and the early spring wind moving the cottonwood branches outside. He asked if it was going to be okay. Warren said he thought so. He said a man at Prairie Iron was looking at the tractor right now and that he was more optimistic than he had been 24 hours ago, though he did not yet know why the optimism was justified. Marcus looked at the old tractor. He said he remembered watching Harold drive it when Marcus was small before Harold's heart had given out, the way Harold had driven it with the total unself-conscious confidence of a man who understood the machine completely, who knew every adjustment it needed before it needed it, who kept it running through a combination of attention and mechanical intuition that Marcus, at age 6 or 7, had thought was something close to magic. Warren said it wasn't magic. He said Harold understood the machines because the machines were simple enough to understand completely before everything became layered with software and control systems and diagnostic codes that told you something was wrong without telling you what or why. The new machines were more capable. More capable meant more acres done right, and more acres done right was the difference between a farm that survived and a farm that didn't. But something had been lost when the machines became too complex to be fully known. Marcus said he'd been thinking about something. Warren waited. Marcus said he had been thinking about staying, not temporarily, not for the planting season, staying and learning the operation the way Warren knew it from the soil up. He said he wasn't sure he'd decided. He said he wasn't sure he'd decided anything. but he had been thinking about it more than he had been thinking about anything else in the past several months. Warren looked at his son. He looked at the expression on Marcus's face, which was not the expression of someone asking for permission. It was the expression of someone who had been working through a question alone for a long time and had arrived at something close to an answer and was now saying it out loud for the first time to see whether it held up. Warren said, "It's not an easy life." Marcus said he knew that. Warren said the land asks more than it gives most years, and the years when it gives more than it asks, you spend getting ready for the years when it doesn't. Marcus said, "I know, Dad." Warren looked at him for another moment. He said, "Then stay." They sat in the old barn for a while longer without talking much, which was comfortable rather than awkward, the quiet of two people who had things to say and had already said the important ones. Ray Kowalski called at 4:47 in the afternoon. His voice on the phone was the same as his voice in person level, and unhurried, proceeding at its own pace rather than adjusting for the listener's urgency. He said, "The diagnostic is complete. The transmission is mechanically sound." Warren said nothing for a moment. Ray said, "I ran the full manual test sequence. Every gear forward and reverse under simulated field load using the shop's resistance apparatus. The clutch packs are engaging correctly. Hydraulic pressure through the transmission is within manufacturer specifications. The mechanical components of the transmission are functioning as designed." He said, "The fault is in the control system. Specifically, there is a position sensor on the gear selector shaft that is producing intermittent false readings. When the sensor reports an inconsistent position, the transmission computer's safety logic interrupts the shift sequence. That's the hesitation you were experiencing. The machine wasn't failing to shift. The machine was being told by its own sensor that it wasn't sure where the gear lever was, and the safety logic was pausing the shift until it received a consistent reading. In addition, the transmission's hydraulic control block had contamination in the valve body. Degraded fluid and particulate matter had accumulated in the valve body's passages, causing sluggish response in the hydraulic actuators. The computer interpreted this sluggish response as a potential mechanical fault and reinforced the hesitation behavior. The machine was in effect overcorrecting for problems that were in its sensing and control system rather than in its mechanical components. The fix was to replace the position sensor and disassemble, clean, and rebuild the valve body. Parts $310 for the replacement sensor, $490 for valve body seals, cleaning materials, and a replacement accumulator spring with fatigue cracks. Total parts cost $800. Labor, he estimated, 13 hours. He could start first thing in the morning. Total repair cost approximately $2,850. He would have a firm number once the disassembly was complete and he could see what the valve body looked like internally. Warren asked, "And if it doesn't fix it?" Ray said, "If the repair is complete and the tractor still exhibits the same behavior, Prairie Iron absorbs the labor. You pay only for the parts." He said this not as a promotional offer, but as a statement of professional accountability. If his diagnosis was wrong, the cost of being wrong was his. Warren authorized the repair. He put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he went to find Barbara. She was at the desk in the small office off the kitchen, the room that had been Harold's den and that Warren had converted to the farm's administrative space after Harold died. She looked up from whatever she was working on and read his expression. He said, $2,850, maybe a little more. She looked at him without speaking for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup, held it with both hands and said, "Well," he said, "yeah. She said your father always said the machine doesn't lie." Warren said he remembered. She said, "Sounds like this one was telling the truth. You just had to find the right person to listen to it." He went to bed that night and slept, which was the first night in a week that he had. Ray called at 3:40 in the afternoon on the second day. The sensor was replaced. The valve body had been fully disassembled, cleaned with ultrasonic equipment, inspected under magnification, fitted with new seals and the replacement accumulator spring, and reinstalled. Ray had run the tractor through 3 hours of test cycles in the shop using the hydraulic resistance apparatus to simulate field load conditions. Every gear, every direction, every load level from light transport to maximum working load. The transmission had performed through the entire test sequence without a single hesitation, without a single fault code, without a single anomaly of any kind. The invoice was $2,910, slightly over the estimate because the internal inspection of the valve body had revealed a second accumulator spring with fatigue damage that Ray had replaced as a precaution. He said he was sorry for the overage. Warren told him not to be. He drove to Prairie Iron in the late afternoon. Ray walked him through the work in the shop bay, pointing to the replacement parts he had set aside for Warren to see, explaining the condition of the contaminated valve body before and after cleaning in the technical but accessible language of a man who respected the intelligence of the person he was talking to. He showed Warren the position sensor's connector, where the corrosion on the contact pins had been the immediate cause of the intermittent signal failures. Warren looked at the sensor. He looked at the tractor. He looked at the invoice. He shook Ray's hand. He shook Gerald Sutter's hand. He loaded the 733OR onto the trailer and drove it home in the early evening light with the last of the April sun running flat and golden across the fields on either side of the county road. He thought for most of the drive about one specific number, not 71,000, not 2,910. He thought about the number 420, which was what Callaway had charged him for an incomplete diagnostic that had produced a wrong answer. He thought about the fact that the wrong answer, if he had accepted it without question, would have cost him somewhere between $52,000 and $71,000 more than the right answer cost, plus an entire planting season, plus the financial stress of financing a new machine he didn't need. He thought about Pete Ramsden sitting at his kitchen table, saying quietly that he had never brought a machine to Callaway after 2016. He thought about what he was going to do next. He knew what he was going to do. He had known since Ray had said the machine is mechanically sound, but he was going to wait. He was going to put the tractor in the field and let it prove in the only language that mattered on a working farm whether the repair had been correct. He was going to give it at least 10 days. Then he was going to drive to Grafton. The 7330R ran for 11 days without a single fault. Warren pushed it the way he pushed every machine during planting season because planting season did not allow for gentleness, and a machine that couldn't handle the work was a machine that needed to be dealt with before planting rather than during it. He ran it on 12-hour shifts. He ran it through the wet clay ground in the lower river bottom field, where hydraulic demand peaked and the transmission worked hardest where any marginal repair would have shown itself within the first 2 hours. He ran it on the third day through a 14-hour shift that went past 10 o'clock at night, when the temperature dropped 30 degrees and the cold stressed the hydraulic fluid's viscosity in ways that could unmask repairs that were technically correct but slightly incomplete. Every morning he climbed into the cab expecting to find the hesitation waiting for him. Every morning the tractor started clean, shifted through its range without a pause, and ran its hours without complaint. Every shift change was smooth. Every gear change was immediate. The machine performed the way it had performed before the fault had appeared, which was to say it performed with the unobtrusive reliability of well-maintained equipment that was doing exactly what it was designed to do. On the 11th day, Warren came in at noon from the morning shift cleaned up, put on the clothes he wore when he went somewhere that mattered, and drove his truck to Grafton. He had 3 pieces of paper on the passenger seat: the Callaway diagnostic sheet, the receipt for the $420 incomplete diagnostic, the Prairie Iron invoice for $2,910. He parked in the Callaway lot at 12:20 in the afternoon on a Thursday. He went inside. The service desk was staffed by a young woman he didn't recognize. He asked for Dex Hartman. She said she would check. She came back a minute later and said Dex was available. Warren waited in the customer area. He looked at the photographs of farms and equipment on the walls. He recognized two of the farm photographs, both from fields he had driven past hundreds of times. He had been in this room many times over 12 years and had never looked at the photographs carefully before. Dex came out through the door to the service area. He was in his navy jacket with the dealership logo on the chest. His expression was composed in the way of a man who managed difficult customer conversations regularly enough to have a professional relationship with them. They shook hands. Dex said it was good to see him. He asked how the planting was going. Warren said the planting was going fine. He put the 3 documents on the service counter between them without preamble and without raising his voice. He said, "You told me this tractor needed a transmission replacement. I had someone else look at it." Dex picked up the Prairie Iron invoice. He read it with careful attention, the same careful attention Warren had seen him apply to every document in every interaction they'd had over the years. He read through the parts list, the labor breakdown, the description of the repair. He turned the sheet over. He read the front again. He put it down. He said, "You took it to Prairie Iron." Warren said Ray Kowalski at Prairie Iron. He found a position sensor with corroded contacts and a contaminated valve body. 2 days, $2,910. The tractor has run 11 days straight without a single transmission fault. Dex nodded slowly. He said, "I'm glad the tractor is operational." Warren said, "Your diagnostic told me the transmission needed to be replaced. Ray's diagnostic found the transmission was mechanically sound and never needed replacement. He ran the manual test sequence, step 2 of the manufacturer's standard diagnostic protocol. Your technician didn't run it." Dex picked up the original diagnostic sheet. He looked at it. He set it down. He said, "Our diagnostic followed manufacturer protocol. The fault code we identified was consistent with transmission control unit failure. Our recommendation was based on that code and on the hydraulic wear indicators present in the system data." Warren said, "Your recommendation was based on an incomplete diagnostic. The manual test is part of the protocol. It wasn't performed. If it had been performed, your technician would have found what Ray found, a control system problem, not a transmission problem. The transmission was fine. Your diagnostic didn't test it." Dex was quiet for a moment. He arranged the 3 papers on the counter in a small stack. He said, "I understand the repair costs were significantly different, and I understand the frustration. But our protocols are designed to protect customers from failures that develop into larger problems later. A conservative recommendation on a transmission failure indication isn't negligent. It's risk management." Warren said, "A conservative recommendation that costs $68,000 more than the actual repair isn't conservative. It's wrong." He said the word the same way he always said important words, without anger, without theater, with the flat deliberateness of a man presenting a fact. Dex looked at him. He did not dispute the word. He did not offer an alternative characterization. He looked at Warren with the expression of a man who had absorbed the full weight of a statement and recognized that arguing with it was not going to change what it meant. He said, "I'm not in a position to second-guess a completed repair at a competitor's shop based on their invoice." Warren said, "The tractor running for 11 days without fault is the second-guessing. I'm not asking you to agree with their diagnosis. I'm telling you what happened. You said $71,000 and 7 weeks. A Massey Ferguson dealer fixed it for $2,910 in 2 days. That is the entire difference between what you told me and what was true." He paused. He looked at Dex for a moment across the counter, across the 12 years of service appointments and parts orders and transactions that had built a relationship now in the process of being unmade. He said, "I've been doing business here for 12 years. I brought you every service job, every parts purchase, every equipment conversation that came through my operation for 12 years. You told me I needed a repair that would have cost me more than half the value of the machine I brought you on a timeline that would have taken my entire planting season for a problem that needed a 2-day fix. I don't know whether your technician was careless or whether your diagnostic system is designed to produce the most expensive recommendation a fault code will support. Either way, the result for me is the same. He picked up the 3 documents from the counter. He aligned their edges carefully, the way his father had aligned papers by habit and without conscious thought. He said, "I won't be back." He turned and walked out of Callaway Farm Equipment. He walked across the gravel lot to his truck. He did not look back at the building. He drove out of the lot and onto the county road and pointed the truck north toward home. He did not feel relief. He did not feel satisfaction. He felt the clean, uncomplicated clarity of a man who had said what needed to be said in the way it needed to be said and was now finished with that particular piece of unfinished business. The tractor was running. The planting was proceeding. The season had not been lost. Everything else was consequence. The story traveled the way that important stories travel in farming country, not through social media platforms or digital announcement, but through the dense, specific, and remarkably efficient network of rural information exchange. It moved through the coffee counter conversations at the grain elevator, where farmers gathered in the mornings before the day's work began, and exchanged the kind of direct information-dense talk that people who work close to the same variables develop over years of shared circumstance. It moved through the county co-op meetings where farmers made purchasing decisions and compared operational notes and asked each other the kind of frank questions they would not ask anyone outside the room. It moved through the equipment auctions in spring and fall, where farmers from 3 and 4 counties gathered and conducted the business of buying and selling machinery with the efficiency of people who understood value and had no patience for imprecision. Warren told his version of it when he was asked. He was asked regularly because the story had enough specificity to travel as a complete account rather than as a rumor. The numbers were too precise and too verifiable for distortion. $52,000 to $71,000. $2,910. 11 days running clean. These were not the kind of numbers that traveled in the inflated or deflated form that rumors typically take. They traveled as facts, because they were facts, and because everyone who heard them recognized immediately what they meant. Warren told the story without embellishment and without moralizing. He described what had happened in the sequence. It had happened starting with the fault and ending with the tractor in the field, and he let the numbers do the interpretation that numbers do when they are dramatic enough on their own. He did not speculate about Callaway's motivations. He did not accuse anyone of deliberate dishonesty. He described what the diagnostic had found and what Ray had found and what the difference between those two things had meant for his planting season and his financial position. He let his listeners draw their own conclusions, and his listeners were experienced enough in the economics of farm equipment service to know exactly what to conclude. Pete Ramsden started telling his own story after Warren's conversation in October. He had kept it private for 2 years because he hadn't had enough certainty to say definitively what had happened to him. Warren's story gave him the certainty or something close enough to it to make speaking worth the discomfort. He told it at the County Farm Bureau meeting in October 2018, and 3 other farmers in the room said with varying degrees of detail and certainty that they had experienced situations with Callaway that had left them with questions they hadn't known how to pursue. One of those farmers was Jim Caldwell. Jim Caldwell farmed 2,400 acres of corn and soybeans east of Warren's property land that butted up against the same drainage basin and responded to the same weather patterns, and was worked by a man of 60 who had been in the county his whole life and who had a reputation for being methodical, fair, and not given to exaggeration. Jim had brought a John Deere tractor to Callaway in September of 2018, 4 months after Warren's situation with a hydraulic problem. The symptoms were sluggish hydraulic response under heavy load and occasional pressure fluctuations in the loader circuit. Callaway had run a diagnostic. The diagnostic had produced an estimate of $74,000 for a comprehensive hydraulic system overhaul, including pump replacement control valve, replacement hydraulic line flushing, and replacement in several sections and associated labor. Jim had signed the service authorization and paid a deposit. The work had been scheduled and was in progress. Jim had been at the Farm Bureau meeting in October. He had heard Pete Ramsden's account and then Warren's account, and had felt in the particular way that people feel when information arrives that recontextualizes their own experience, the specific cold clarity of someone who has just understood something about a situation they are currently in. He drove to Prairie Iron the following morning. Ray Kowalski looked at the service documentation Jim brought. He reviewed the estimate, the diagnostic sheet, the description of work in progress at Callaway. He said he couldn't evaluate work that was currently being performed at another shop, but based on what he was reading, the scope of the recommended repairs was broader than the diagnostic findings typically supported for the described symptoms on that model. He strongly recommended that Jim ask Callaway to stop work immediately and provide a detailed breakdown of what had been completed versus what remained. Jim asked Callaway to stop work. He engaged an independent equipment consultant, a retired dealership technician from a shop in Grand Island with no business relationship with either Callaway or Prairie Iron, to review the service documentation. The consultant spent 2 days reviewing the diagnostic data, the parts billing, and the service records. His conclusion was methodical and specific. The hydraulic pump that Callaway had already replaced had been within operational specification before the replacement. The decision to replace it was not supported by the diagnostic data. The pump replacement represented $22,000 of the $74,000 estimate. The remaining work that Callaway had planned included component replacements that the consultant characterized as precautionary at best and not indicated by the diagnostic findings at worst. The consultant estimated that the legitimate repairs indicated by Jim's actual symptoms should have cost between $8,000 and $14,000. Jim Caldwell did not pursue litigation. He was 60 years old with no interest in the financial and emotional cost of a legal fight against a dealership's insurance team, a fight that would take years and produce uncertain results regardless of the merits. He recovered the tractor in its partially repaired state, had Prairie Iron complete the legitimate remaining work for $7,800, and had Callaway refund the portion of his deposit that corresponded to work not yet performed. The portion of the deposit corresponding to the already replaced pump was not recovered. But Jim Caldwell told the story. He told it the way Warren told his, plainly and specifically, with the numbers intact and the timeline clear, and he told it to everyone who asked him about it, which was a lot of people once word circulated that Jim had stopped the work and brought in an independent evaluator. In a county where everyone knew what everyone else's equipment problems were before the affected farmer had finished his second cup of coffee, Jim Caldwell stopping a $74,000 Callaway job midway through was not a small event. The combined weight of Warren's story and Pete Ramsden's story and Jim Caldwell's story and the 3 other partial accounts from the Farm Bureau meeting settled over the county's farming community in the fall of 2018, with the quiet, comprehensive effect that shared information has in closed communities where reputations take years to build and considerably less time to erode. Callaway Farm Equipment did not close. It was a substantial business with deep roots in the county and a customer base that extended well beyond the farming community that was reassessing its relationship with the service department. Equipment sales continued. Parts continued to move. New farmers in the county, or farmers whose relationship with Callaway had been positive, continued to bring machines in. Institutional momentum is a real force, and it takes time for the consequences of lost trust to fully accumulate in an organization's revenue numbers. But the service department at Callaway lost 11 regular service accounts between the fall of 2018 and the end of 2019. 11 farms, whose operators had, for various reasons, and in response to various combinations of their own experience and the circulating accounts of other farmers, decided to bring their maintenance and repair work elsewhere. Some went to Prairie Iron, some went to independent shops, some traveled further to dealers in other counties. The reasons varied in specifics but shared a common structure. They were no longer confident that Callaway's diagnostic recommendations were accurate and in a service relationship that is entirely built on trust. In technical judgment, the absence of that confidence was the absence of the relationship. Dex Hartman submitted his resignation to Callaway's management in March of 2020. The management team did not announce the departure publicly or offer any explanation for it. The service department was restructured under a new manager brought in from outside the county, a woman named Patricia Voss, who had spent 15 years in heavy equipment service and who implemented in her first 6 weeks a revised diagnostic protocol that required technician certification of completed mechanical testing before any repair estimate above $10,000 could be issued to a customer. Whether this change was driven by the loss of service revenue by some form of internal review process or by the new manager's own professional standards, Warren never knew. He had no ongoing interest in Callaway's internal operations. He had said what he had to say. The consequences were not his to manage or monitor. Prairie Iron Equipment's service department grew by 24% between the spring of 2018 and the end of 2021. Gerald Sutter attributed the growth to several factors when he discussed it multiple years later with Warren over coffee in the Prairie Iron office on a winter afternoon, when neither of them had anywhere urgent to be. There was organic growth from the expanding Massey Ferguson customer base in the region. There was growth from farmers who had been doing their own maintenance and had decided the time cost was no longer worth it. And there was the growth that came from the conversations that had been happening in the county since the fall of 2018, which Gerald described simply as people deciding to find out whether the reputation was deserved. He said he had heard Warren's story told back to him in various forms at least 15 times in the 2 years following the events. He said he had never repeated it himself. He didn't need to. Warren said he hadn't told it to generate business for Prairie Iron. He'd told it because it was true and because it was the kind of true that farmers needed to know. Gerald said that was the thing about stories in a small community. You didn't need to tell them for any particular purpose. You just had to tell them accurately, and they found their purpose on their own. Ray Kowalski was promoted to lead technician at Prairie Iron in January of 2020. Gerald told Warren about it in passing when Warren came in for the Massey's spring service appointment. Warren went to find Ray in the shop and offered his congratulations. Ray was underneath a combine header doing something with a hydraulic line, and he looked up at Warren from the floor with the expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of a task and would like to return to it. He said, "Thanks. Gerald's paying me more to do the same work." Warren said that sounded like a reasonable arrangement. Ray said, "I just tested what needed to be tested. That's the whole job." He went back to the hydraulic line. Warren stood in the shop bay for a moment after that with the smell of diesel and hydraulic fluid and metal in the air, and the sound of other technicians working in other bays, and the early January light coming through the high windows at a low angle that made everything in the shop look both ordinary and in some way Warren couldn't have explained significant. He thought about what Ray had said. "I just tested what needed to be tested." It was a statement about professional responsibility that was simultaneously a quiet and entirely accurate indictment of what had not happened at Callaway. Ray had not done anything exceptional. He had done what the job required, which was to complete the diagnostic procedure, rather than stopping at the point where the procedure produced a result that matched a high-revenue repair recommendation. He had followed through to the step where the machine itself had to be consulted, rather than only the electronic record of what the machine thought was happening to itself. It was not a difficult thing to do. It was just a thing that required the kind of professional commitment that puts accuracy above convenience and long-term customer relationships above short-term billing efficiency. It required valuing the right answer more than the easy answer. It was the whole job. By the spring of 2021, Warren Holt's equipment yard held 4 Massey Ferguson tractors, a Massey Ferguson combine, 2 Massey Ferguson grain carts, and 1 older John Deere that was waiting for a trade-in opportunity at a price Warren found acceptable. The transition had not happened dramatically or as a statement. It had happened as the natural consequence of a series of decisions made over 3 years, each of which was based on the same arithmetic: lower acquisition cost, lower operating cost, reliable dealer relationship, accurate service. The last John Deere purchase decision Warren had evaluated had been in the fall of 2019, when one of his primary field tractors was due for replacement, and he had gone through the market analysis he did every time a machine reached the end of its useful life in his fleet. He had run the numbers on both lines, John Deere and Massey Ferguson, for comparable horsepower and specification and hours. The Massey Ferguson number had been better by a margin that was large enough to be meaningful and consistent enough across multiple comparable machines to reflect something structural about the cost difference, rather than a one-time market fluctuation. He had bought the Massey Ferguson. He had called the John Deere dealer in Grafton at a different number than Callaway's, a dealer 60 miles west, to make sure he was evaluating the John Deere option accurately and not letting the Callaway history distort a business decision that should be made on facts. The John Deere dealer 60 miles west had been professional and responsive, and had given him a number that was in fact better than the Massey Ferguson for that specific configuration. Warren had bought the Massey Ferguson anyway because by that point, the Prairie Iron relationship had become a factor in the analysis, in the same way that any operational relationship becomes a factor when it has consistently delivered what it promised. The equipment cost was close, the relationship was not. Marcus had been on the farm full-time since the summer of 2018, when he had come home for the planting season and not returned to Lincoln. The logistics job had been easy to leave, he said, because it had always felt like marking time rather than doing anything that mattered. The farm felt like something that mattered. He had come home to figure out whether that feeling would survive the reality of the work, and it had. By the spring of 2021, Marcus was running the north half of the operation with the kind of independent judgment that Warren reviewed but rarely overrode. He made planting schedule decisions and equipment deployment decisions and agronomic choices that reflected 3 years of intensive learning, which was fast by any measure. He had Harold's eye for soil condition and Warren's patience with uncertainty, which was the right combination for farming in eastern Nebraska, where the soil rewarded attention and the weather required the ability to hold your plans loosely. He had also developed over 3 years of working alongside his father a specific and detailed understanding of the equipment fleet and its maintenance requirements. He knew the service schedules for every machine. He knew the difference between a fault that required immediate attention and a fault that could be monitored through the rest of a shift before evaluation. He knew because Warren had told him, and because Ray Kowalski had explained it to him one afternoon in the Prairie Iron Shop Bay, when Marcus had asked directly how to read a diagnostic fault code as a starting point rather than a conclusion. Ray had spent an hour with Marcus that afternoon walking him through the diagnostic procedure on the Massey Ferguson platform and explaining the relationship between electronic fault flags and actual mechanical condition. He had explained the umbrella code concept. He had explained why the manual test mattered. He had explained how a well-designed diagnostic protocol built in the mechanical verification step, specifically because electronic systems were sophisticated enough to detect variance but not always sophisticated enough to interpret it correctly without human judgment and physical testing. Marcus had taken notes. He had asked good questions. Ray had answered them with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and at the end of the hour had told Marcus that the most important thing a farmer could know about his equipment was the difference between what a machine reported and what a machine actually needed, because those two things were not always the same. Warren had stood at the edge of that conversation listening to it and had thought about Harold's voice saying, "The machine doesn't lie." He had thought about the gap between that principle which was true and which Harold had built his whole mechanical philosophy on, and the specific complexity of modern equipment where the machine's report of itself could be accurate at the level of data and misleading at the level of meaning. The machine didn't lie, but the code that the machine produced when something varied from its baseline wasn't the same thing as the machine's condition. Understanding the difference was the job. It was the whole job. On a morning in late April 2021, Warren stood at the edge of the equipment yard in the early light, holding a coffee cup he'd carried out from the kitchen, without quite deciding to watching Marcus pull the big Massey Ferguson out of the barn for the first field shift of the season. The machine moved through the yard in the particular deliberate way of heavy equipment at low speed, with the hydraulic system cycling as the loader came to its transport position and the tractor found its balance for road travel. Marcus's silhouette was visible through the cab glass, making the pre-movement equipment check that Warren had taught him the scan of dash instruments and mirror positions and hydraulic pressure gauges that you did every time before you put a machine into field operation, the check that identified 90% of problems before they became problems. The tractor reached the yard gate and turned onto the field road. The exhaust note changed as Marcus brought the RPM up for road speed. The machine moved away down the field road and grew smaller in the morning light, and Warren watched it until it crested the small rise where the road turned north and disappeared from the yard's sight line. He stood in the yard with his coffee and looked at the empty gate. He thought about his grandfather Elias standing on this ground in the spring of 1932 with the equipment of that era, and the uncertainty of that era, and the particular stubborn commitment to this piece of land that had produced everything that had followed. He thought about Harold sitting at the kitchen table, going over maintenance sheets with cold coffee, saying, "Don't let the land sleep," saying the machine doesn't lie, saying the things he said every fall that sounded like practical advice and were actually something larger, a philosophy about attention and responsibility and the relationship between a person and the work they had chosen and the ground they had been entrusted with. He thought about a yellow legal pad on a metal table in a prairie iron service bay with 3 items written on it in Ray Kowalski's compressed handwriting. A fault code, a diagnosis, a number, $2,850. He thought about Dex Hartman's face when Warren had put the prairie iron invoice on the Callaway service counter and said the word wrong. He thought about Pete Ramsden sitting at his kitchen table, saying quietly that he had never brought a machine to Callaway after 2016. He thought about Jim Caldwell standing in the Prairie Iron parking lot with his service documentation and the particular expression of a man who has just understood something he should have understood earlier and is working out what to do with the understanding. He thought about the 11 days the 7330R had run clean through the first hard week of planting 2018, the days when every successful shift had been a small confirmation of what Ray had said the machine actually needed. He thought about what he had told Marcus the night Marcus had come home from Lincoln's Stay. One word. The simplest possible answer to the most important question the farm had faced in a generation. He hadn't delivered a speech. He hadn't laid out an argument. He had said the one word that was both the answer and the invitation, and Marcus had understood it the way you understand things that have been building toward their moment for years. Warren finished his coffee. He carried the cup back inside. He put it on the counter and looked at the kitchen table where he and Barbara had sat with the bad numbers a little more than 3 years ago. The $71,000 and the 7 to 9 weeks and the $195,000 financing option and the calendar that would not wait. He looked at the chair where Pete Ramsden had sat. He looked at the window that showed the equipment yard and the field road and the rise where the tractor had just disappeared. The land was waking up. He had a full day's work in front of him. He had a field monitoring check to complete in the north section before the soil temperature hit the threshold for planting. He had a seed delivery from the co-op arriving at 2 in the afternoon that needed to be received and logged against the purchase order. He had a phone call with his agronomist scheduled for 3 o'clock about the phosphorus application rate on the river bottom ground, where the drainage tile he'd installed in 2019 had changed the soil moisture profile in ways that were still working their way through the nutrient management calculations. He had Marcus to check in with at midday about the morning shift's progress in the north field. He had the work. He had always had the work. The work was the reason the farm was still here, and the reason it would be here for whoever came after Marcus, and the reason Harold had kept farming until the week he died, and Elias had stayed on this ground through the drought years when every sensible argument said to leave. You stayed because the land asked for your attention, and you were the one who had committed to giving it. You stayed because the work mattered in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not done it, but that was immediately obvious to people who had. You stayed because the ground your grandfather had broken and your father had improved and you had maintained was now partly being worked by your son, and that continuity was the thing that justified everything else, the debt and the weather and the equipment failures and the years when the market was wrong and the years when the weather was wrong and all the things that could go wrong in an enterprise that depended on factors no human being controlled. You stayed and you paid attention and you didn't let the land sleep. Warren Holt put on his work jacket and his cap. He went out into the April morning and got in his truck and drove north toward the fields that were waking up under the spring sky of eastern Nebraska, the fields that 3 generations of his family had worked, and that a 4th was now learning, the fields that had no patience for the problems of the people who farmed them and no concern for anything except whether those people were paying attention. He was paying attention. He was going to be paying attention for as long as there was ground to tend and daylight to tend it in, and strength in his hands to do the work the season required. The land had asked the question. It asked every spring. Warren Holt, as he had been doing every spring for 22 years without his father and 30 years before that with him, was ready with the answer. 3 years after the morning Warren had driven home from Callaway with the Prairie Iron invoice on the passenger seat, a farmer from 2 counties west stopped him at a grain elevator in the first week of April to ask him about his fleet. The man was maybe 50, with the specific combination of sunburn and calculation in his face that Warren associated with people who had been doing serious outdoor work for a long time and who evaluated everything they encountered, including other people, in terms of its practical value. The man said he'd heard Warren had switched to Massey Ferguson. He said he was thinking about buying a utility tractor, and the Massey Ferguson 7726 had come up in the conversation he'd been having with his dealer. He asked if Warren had been happy with the switch. Warren said yes. The man asked why. Warren told him. He told him about the 733 OR and the fault and the diagnostic and the $71,000 estimate and the 7 to 9 weeks. He told him about Prairie Iron and Ray Kowalski and the yellow legal pad and the $2,910. He told him about the 11 days the machine had run clean through the first week of planting. He told him about the conversation with Dex Hartman and the word wrong. He told it the same way he always told it, plainly, sequentially, with the numbers intact and the sequence accurate. He didn't editorialize. He didn't conclude. He let the story reach the end it always reached and let his listener interpret it. The man from 2 counties west was quiet for a moment when Warren finished. Then he said, "How's the service?" Warren said, "Find Gerald Sutter at Prairie Iron. Bring him your equipment. See what he tells you." The man said, "What if the diagnosis is bad news?" Warren said, "Then he'll tell you the real bad news." Not the expensive version of bad news that turns out to be good news with a wrong price tag. The actual condition of the machine. You can work with that. You can't work with a number that's wrong by $68,000. The man from 2 counties west nodded. He looked at the ground for a moment, which was the way Warren had seen many farmers receive information they were integrating into an existing set of considerations, the information finding its place in the larger structure of what they knew and needed. He said, "I appreciate it." Warren said, "It's a true story. That's all it is." He finished his business at the elevator and drove home in the spring morning. The road ran between fields that were still bare, the soil turned and waiting the particular dark color of eastern Nebraska ground in April, when the moisture content was right and the temperature was building toward the threshold that would signal it was time. He knew this road and these fields the way he knew his own handwriting, knew the name of every farm he passed, knew whose drainage was good and whose was marginal, knew which parcels had changed hands in the past decade, and which had been in the same family since before Warren had been born. He knew the land. He had been paying attention to it his whole life, and he intended to keep paying attention to it for the rest of it, and after that, it was Marcus's to tend, and maybe one day, Marcus's children, if the land and the family and the particular stubborn commitment that Elias had brought to this ground in 1931 continued to align in the way that had kept this farm intact through 90 years of weather and markets and equipment failures and all the other ways that a farm can fail when the people tending it stop paying close enough attention. The land didn't ask for much. It asked for attention. It asked for care. It asked for the willingness to find the real answer even when the easy answer was more available, and the people with something to gain from the easy answer were telling you it was the right one. Warren had learned that lesson in the spring of 2018 in a Prairie Iron service bay, watching Ray Kowalski read a diagnostic sheet and say 4 words, "This is a trigger code, not a conclusion, a trigger, a starting point, an invitation to look further." The real answer was always further in. The real answer required the second step, the manual test, the physical verification that went beyond what the code reported to what the machine actually was. The real answer required someone who valued accuracy more than ease, and who had enough professional integrity to follow the procedure all the way to the end, even the parts of the procedure that took longer and required more work and produced results that might not match the most profitable recommendation. The real answer required someone who was doing the whole job. Warren had found that person when he needed to, which was good fortune of the kind you couldn't plan for, but could recognize and hold on to once it arrived. He had held on to it. Gerald Sutter and Ray Kowalski had earned a relationship that was going to last as long as Warren farmed, and Marcus was already building his own version of it, asking his own questions in the Prairie Iron Shop Bay, and getting the same straight answers that Warren had been getting for 5 years. The farm was in good hands. The land was paying attention to whoever was paying attention to it. Warren turned into the farm lane and followed it up to the equipment yard. He could see Marcus's tractor in the far north field, a small red shape moving steadily across the dark ground, leaving the precise parallel lines that indicated a planting pass was in progress. He watched it for a moment from the truck window before he got out. The red shape moved to the end of the field, turned with the particular geometry of a machine that knew exactly where it was through GPS guidance, and started back on the next pass. The work was going well. The season had started. The land was waking up. Warren got out of his truck, put his gloves on, and went to work.